about food today. Ooh, this is my favorite topic. So we're just going to I'm going to move you through some introductory slides. Martin's going to take you through kind of a history of urban agriculture. Then we're going to give you some examples of land trusts doing really cool stuff. And at that point, we're going to bring up Heather to talk about this cool program they're doing in Athens. All right. A few assorted ones. Hybrid vigor. This is John Davis's favorite phrase. And I'm reading this really cool science fiction book called The Sparrow by Mary Doria Russell. Anybody read it? Anyway, I'm reading it on page 130. They talk about hybrid vigor. So I figured it must mean something. And there, Father Emilio isn't recovering from his arduous journey back from some planet, I don't remember its name. And it's and because he needs both food and exercise to get healthy. One without the other isn't going to work. So it's the same thing here. You need food and shelter, or it ain't going to work. All right? One without the other doesn't do us much good. But we're not in the food business, right? We're in the housing business. Right? Of course. And we always have been in the housing business, right? Forever.
We're in the problem-solving business.
Well, wait a minute. Where did we get started? New Communities, 1969. That wasn't a 6,000-acre farm, was it? Oh, but before that, in the old days, we were about housing, right? All right, well, there's this guy, and Ebenezer Howard, and John Davis talks about him, and roots of the CLT, and they had these things called garden cities that combined food and shelter, and so now I'm all confused. Our roots are in food? Who knew? Right? But can you really imagine that a ground lease is intended just for keeping housing affordable? It's like using fusion to power a toaster. All right? A ground lease is way too powerful a concept just to apply to housing. All right? This might irritate some people. If all we want to do is to protect the affordability of housing, there's easier ways of doing it than splitting up the bundle of rights. Because when we separate land from improvements, we make it difficult to get mortgage financing. We add complexity in dealing with assessors. We add complexity in dealing with cities. It adds complexity, right? So we shouldn't add complexity unless we really need to do it. And folks don't understand intuitively, I own my house, but I don't own the land under my house. That's confusing to me. But everybody understands a land trust owning a community garden. In my experience, in Madison, Wisconsin, the community didn't understand what we did until we owned a community garden. And when we did that, they understand everything else. All right? So we're going to talk about sustainability. Sometimes people talk about resiliency now. That's the new cool word, but I'm going to use sustainability. All right? And it's not sustainable to live in a well-built, energy-efficient, low-priced house if you can't get to the important stuff, right? And there's a session going on right now about transportation-oriented development. A cool house in the middle of nowhere without any access to any of the important stuff is not sustainable. And if you live somewhere and you don't have access to healthy food that you can afford, it's not going to work either. And what's the healthiest, most affordable food? Well, food you grow yourself, right? Or food grown locally. All right. So, is the word community and community land trust? I think it is, right? And well, how does community come together? We use that term so much. Communities come together when you have shared interests, shared experiences, and shared concerns. If you don't have that stuff present, you don't have community. All right? And growing food together, eating food together, has been the foundation of community building for thousands of years. Right? So why not do stuff that's been proven to work for thousands of years? Right? That's a long track record. Food is the glue that sticks people together. So in this workshop, we're going to talk about land trusts. You have conservation land trusts, community land trusts. It's always so confusing to everybody else except for us. right? But there's a point of overlap between those movements, and it's agriculture, right? And so you've got community land trusts doing awesome stuff with ag, and conservation land trusts doing awesome stuff with ag. And for the purposes of this presentation, we love everybody, and we're talking about the land trust period. However, CLTs have a unique role to play in what I call food-oriented development, right? Because we could do food and we could do the shelter. And conservation land trusts don't do that. That's our unique role to play. Because remember, after all, CLTs can practically do anything, right? All right. Martin. Introduce Martin Belke from the coolest urban agriculture organization in the world, Growing Power in Milwaukee, Wisconsin.
Well, as shown by the wardrobe, I'm actually on the staff of Growing Power because Greg and I didn't coordinate wardrobes. I didn't wear my Growing Power shirt, but I'm happy that Greg did. Well, first of all, let me say first, thank you for having me here. I'm kind of a newbie at the CLT movement, although being from Madison, Wisconsin, and being a planner and being an urban agriculture person, you naturally get pulled to Troy Gardens, that project, which I'll talk about just a little bit, which is how I first worked with Greg. Now, what Greg had talked about in terms of the urban farming movement, I'm going to try and show is not new. And that you probably maybe are already thinking of examples in the past that you've known about, or whether the slides I'm going to show are going to say, oh yeah, I know that project. It's true. People have been thinking about this way into the past. So Greg kind of briefly talked about Ebenezer Howard, and if you remember, there was, I don't know if you get, the slide wasn't all long enough, but there were 3 magnets there. There was a town magnet, a country magnet, and what's called a town-country magnet. And Howard's belief was that you could conceive an idea that would combine the best of town, or city, and country. And because at that point in the late 19th century, industrialization was making urban living very difficult for a lot of people. Is retreating to the country the alternative? Well, for some people, yeah, but Howard and others thought that there'd be a way of bringing those two things together. And what Howard did, 1902, was to develop this concept of the Garden City, which I'm sure most of you have seen or know about before. And what you see here is not an actual plan for a city, but it's a diagrammic representation that would essentially be matched to a particular piece of land. But the Garden City would have no more than 32,000 people, which was the number that Howard felt was the right size for a sustainable urban development. And it's also large enough that everybody could walk everywhere, including to food production sites. So you had 6 wards, and this is a cutaway of one of the 6 wards. Folks would live in here, but on the outside, you would have allotments. Right? So you could live here, walk out here, grow your food, and you can even have food outside of your house. Outside of that allotment belt, you had cow pastures, allotments, fruit farms, all in close proximity. So this would be 1,000 acres, this would be 5,000 acres, it would operate as a unit. You still had a little bit of spatial segregation between the two, but essentially they were close by. It became part of your life. The idea then, as Greg pointed out in Letchworth and Welland Garden City and others, these became fundamental to the principles of British Newtown planning. Now here in this country, Frank Lloyd Wright, who always thought about society and how architecture design fits with the changing modes and dimensions of society, he was thinking about this himself. And from the 1930s to the end of his life in 1959, he would occasionally go back to this idea they'd be called Broadacre City. And there are some similarities with Howard's idea and some differences with Howard's idea. The big difference was that Broadacre City was geared more toward the individual. Because we're in America, right? Self-interest, everything else. And that individualism to Wright was prompted by the automobile. So in Broadacre City, no one took a, well, I guess people could take buses, but the whole idea of Broadacre City was premised on everybody having a car and individual mobility. So as a result, things were much more spread out, even to the point of Wright thinking that this idea could be a national plan. And the reason it could be a national plan is because the ideas were framed by the already existing grid system of township, section, and range that was established by the Northwest Ordinance of 1785, which everything west of Ohio was essentially kind of gridded on. So Wright's idea was that you could take that framework, plus being a good Midwesterner, that's simply how he thought of things, and that you could arrange for houses, for schools, for factories, for orchards, for vineyards, and just all fit them in within the grid. So what he developed over the years, and he had his apprentices build models and do drawings and everything over the years to kind of refine the idea, but it was really a working landscape where you had houses, and each family would have more or less an acre. So you had plenty of room to grow your own food, right? So this wasn't high density by any means, right? This was pretty spread out. But what you came up with was a working landscape where, and I always like to imagine the idea that if you were a kid going to school in the morning, every day you would walk to school or drive to school. But on the way, you would pass a farmer working in the field every day. It became part of your daily existence. So you had this very tight relationship between a new modern life lived in your beautiful kind of modern home with all the newest technologies. But as you went to school, as you went to the store, wherever, you passed working farming, working landscapes. As you see here, and in this again was kind of a schematic diagram, but this is all orchards and vineyards. So 20% of the area would be devoted to food production. So it wasn't really executed anywhere, but Wright being who he was and writing about it and speaking about it had some salience to a lot of people. Now, another time when food production was very important, of course, was actually a few times throughout the 20th century, but specifically during World War I and World War II, where you had the Victory Garden movement, which I think everyone's heard of in one degree or another. It was really almost the golden age for urban farming in this country that, of course, was prompted by an external stimulus, right? The need to internally secure our food supply. So one thing that characterizes the movements during there were two world wars was that the programs that were associated with it, and there was of course lots of propaganda that went along with that, they were targeted at all Americans. During the Depression there were garden programs, but it was really focused on people that were most in need. Same thing in the 19th century when you had vacant lot garden programs and things. It identified poor people and immigrants. But during World War I and World War II, everybody, Uncle Sam told everybody to garden to some degree. Right? So that's a big difference. Everybody was encouraged, and a lot of people did. As I said, another important characteristic was it was a very top-down kind of thing. The federal government essentially kind of dictating how things would go, but it was a combination of top-down guidance versus bottom-up action. So the government could encourage people to grow, but the people actually had to get up and figure out what to grow and what to do. So it was a real kind of nice mixture of trying to bring things together. So there's some posters here, and there are like a million different types of ways of conveying this message. And this is in Boston. It's the Fenway, I think it's, I forget what it's called now, the Fenway Gardens, but it's the only Victory Garden left in Boston, but it's still there. And if you are in Boston or if you live in Boston, it's a wonderful place to go. It's just a remnant of the days of when Victory Gardens were everywhere. Now, being more contemporary, going over to Europe, the idea of allotment gardens. And I'm showing Berlin here, but you have them in the Netherlands, you have them in London, you have them in Russia. You've got this variation all throughout Europe. The idea was created in the late 19th century and then formalized in the 1920s. And when I say formalized, really formalized. So there are federal guidelines, federal rules for managing allotment gardens. They're called Bundeskleingartengesetz. Right? And those can be fairly strict about who is it, who isn't. They've got guidelines for for the use of land. There's a 30-30-30 policy, which is that a minimum of 30% of any parcel is used for food production, a maximum of 30% can be built on, and a maximum of 30% can be used for recreation, open space that isn't food production. You can't live here in the allotments, that's another rule, and they're all managed. There's a whole series of do's and don'ts. So very ordered, very run, and that order was developed in the 1920s. These were obviously of great importance during and after World War II, and these had special significance in the days when you had West Berlin and East Berlin, because if you lived in West Berlin, you had a wall separating you from East Germany, and you were, to a lot of degrees, self-sufficient. So if you were living in West Berlin, you really depended a lot on your allotments for your household food security. And today there are over 75,000 of these allotments in Berlin, and the average size is 250 meters square, which is about 50 feet square. Okay. Now back to this country, and moving into the 1970s, I'm using Boston to kind of signify movements that were going on in other cities like New York and Philadelphia, where as a result of civil rights movement and community empowerment and those things, you had instances where there was collective action, and in some of those cities, food production became one of the results of that collective action. In Boston is an example I like to show. And many of you may know the story that back in the 70s or late 60s, early 70s, the state of Massachusetts wanted to plow a freeway through Back Bay, South End, into Roxbury. And there was a lot of public debate, a lot of public pushback. And finally the state relented and said, well, I think you guys are right, maybe we don't need this. And some of that federal highway money was converted to making what's called now the Southwest Corridor, which is a network of open spaces that run from the Back Bay down to Roxbury. And if you know Boston, the Orange Line T runs along the Southwest Corridor. Now sprinkled in here are a lot of small open spaces like tennis courts and recreation things, but there are also gardens, community gardens through there. And that impetus in community gardens, while this was happening here, was also happening in other parts of the South End, where residents in the South End, in Dorchester, South Boston, other place, will look at that lot that's been vacant forever and say, well, no one's doing anything with that, so we're going to take the initiative and do something with it, or make a garden. And so as you're going through those neighborhoods now, there are gardens that have been there for decades and have really become part of the fabric of the community that were initially what we sometimes call guerrilla gardens, where you just squat on land because no one else is doing anything, so by God, why isn't it us? So these two pictures of the Rutland, Washington Community Gardens, which started out as being one of these guerrilla gardens, and now is part of the community and now owned by the South End Lower Roxbury Land Trust, which is a conservation land trust, one of the many that are operating in inner Boston. And because Jason Webb from DS&I was here yesterday, I went to his presentation and I kind of realized, oh my God, I forgot to mention something about DS&I and their food production experience, where they don't necessarily have the experience. Well, first, everyone's familiar with DS&I, more or less, I guess, Build a Street Neighborhood Initiative. And when they were kind of back in the 80s, when they were kind of figuring out, okay, we've sort of done what we wanted to do in terms of seizing control, the community control over this, what do we do with that? And based on what they had seen in other parts of Boston, because that was one of the things about Dudley, is that they didn't want to have happen in Dudley what they saw happen in other parts of Boston. But they also wanted to do in Dudley what they saw happening good in other parts of Boston. And one of those things was a lot of community gardens. So they said, well, that's something we want. They didn't necessarily have the skill set to do that, but eventually they hooked up with an organization called the Food Project, which is based actually in Lincoln, Massachusetts, which is just outside of 128, the Beltline that goes around Boston. And now some of Dudley's land was given over to the Food Project, who then established two food production sites in the heart of the Dudley Triangle. And later, after a lot of other discussion, a greenhouse was developed. At the same time, over in California, specifically in Davis, outside of Sacramento, a guy named Mike Corbett and his then wife Judy met with a bunch of friends and started to think about what does really a sustainable community look like? What could it look like? And what resulted from those discussions was the Village Homes development, which is now today is all built out, has 217 homes on 70 acres. And those homes are, the whole design is based on the principle of the commons. And so all these houses are, of course, there's conserve energy, conserve water. It works on a variety of ecological standards. But food is one of those. And the principle of the commons is laid out when it comes to food production in two ways. One is that there are areas that are common to all householders of village homes. And those are, like a broadacre city, orchards and vineyards here and some growing sites along the west side here. But also almond trees, including an almond orchard here. Okay. Now what's grown here is available to everybody. You have some members, some village homes people are designated the gardeners. They do all of the work. But when it's time to harvest, they put out signs and let people know that fruits and veggies are now available. You know, first come, first serve. Almonds are different in that they're seen as a cash crop. And so it's sort of first come, first serve, but you have, they take these machines and shake the almonds out of the tree, and then they process them, dry them, they shell them. When they're available, they are for sale, first of all, to the village homes people. And then what they don't sell, they'll go to farmers markets, and then they'll sell them to almond distributors. Okay? So they're agricultural lands in common that everybody has access with. But at another level of the commons, in each grouping of 4 homes, 8 homes, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, they're designed that there's green space between them. And so each family will have some growing space right outside their door. But the space between their house and the house over here is decided by the 8 families. It could be nothing, it could be perennials, or it could be fruit trees, whatever you want to do, right, in that space there. And so that's sprinkled throughout the whole development here. So when you add everything up, 20% of the site is devoted to food production, including, as I said, almond trees along the street, which is the big cash crop. Now, outside of Chicago, in Grays Lake, Illinois, in the late 80s, another kind of mindset for this was developed, and that's one which is, I'm going to say, let's say more upscale than some of the other things that I talked about here. So the Prairie Crossing development are much bigger homes that are still sitting within conserved agricultural land, but in this case much more, like 60%. Right? So there's a working organic farm in the middle called Sand Hill Organics. There are about 350 homes now that have built out. They're developing about 39 condominiums right now. But and they've literally written a book on this. This is a book called Building Communities with Farms, which was written by the Rainey's, who were the major kind of developers and conceptualizers behind this, and other folks as well. But that's the whole idea, kind of building communities with farms. Although, if you go to the website and you look at their 10 principles, none of those 10 principles specifically mention food or agriculture. They talk about conservation and quality of life and other things too, but you have to kind of look between the lines to see where food falls into those 10 guidelines. But you know, on a daily basis, you can take a walk with the kids, and there's a barn right across the street. Again, just like the Broadacre City idea. And then the Troy Gardens project in Madison, which I'm sure many of you know and been to presentations. Just very briefly, this was 31 acres on the north side of Madison that had been owned by the state of Wisconsin. It went on the surplus list. The neighbors that lived across the street, who had appropriated it as a de facto park for their use, decided we don't want the state to sell it to developers who will attract housing across it. And over the course of a multi-year community engagement process, came up with a plan that now involves 30 acres of a mixture of market and market rate and affordable housing, over 200 community garden plots. There were community gardens on the site initially, so this is really an extension of what was there before. 4.5 acre CSA farm, community supported agriculture, that has, I forget how many state shareholders they have, like 120 I think, and then a restored prairie. And what's important for our discussion here is that this was the coming together, a marriage of both kinds of land trusts. So the Madison Area Community Land Trust that Greg was executive director on at the time owns the land and developed the 30 units of housing here. The remaining 26 acres are managed by a conservation land trust, the Center for Resilient Cities, that operates under a conservation easement. And the programs on the site are run by a nonprofit called Community Groundworks. So you've got 3 layers of managed ownership or management there. Okay. Now, what's happening in the urban agriculture world is that we're having this shift from what community gardens represent, which is that you're out growing food for yourselves and friends and neighbors, to commercial growing, which is much more deliberate. So when you look at those two ideas, growing food commercially, growing food non-commercially in urban areas, there are some similarities between those two and differences between those two. Okay. Similarities is that you're intending to grow food, right? There's an objective to your getting down and preparing the soil and planting and harvesting and weeding and all those other things you do. That you're geared toward the end product, which is food. The food is always going to be fresh and locally produced. The growing will always require a growing medium. Seeds need something to grow in, but it doesn't necessarily have to be soil. Okay, you could do what's called hydroponics, which is where you essentially grow seeds or plants in mostly water that has been to which nutrients have been added. So you don't necessarily need soil. Urban agriculture, if you use various controls like greenhouses and things, can be developed 12 months. You can grow food over 12 months, which of course is clearly important in a place like Wisconsin where you have much shorter growing season. And you can also include livestock within local regulations, but that's kind of like the next frontier in all of this. But there's some rather stark differences then between commercial and non-commercial growing. In commercial growing, you're growing it for revenue, and not necessarily for subsistence or need, or it should also say because you just desire to, you just want to. Basically what you're doing is that you're managing this like any farmer manages his or her farm. Right? It's a business. You're growing food deliberately, like I showed in the previous slide, but the reason for it is different. You're producing food, but you also produce money. Because you're running a farm, you have the same risk management issues as farmers do. The weather, those things that are out of your control, being normal. Commercial growing in cities is more likely to be affected by land use regulations because of this money component. So a zoning ordinance that will allow community gardens may not allow for the selling of food because that brings a different aspect to it, a different dimension to it, and will complicate things, in some cases, quite a bit. There are labor issues involved. Right? If you're growing at a certain scale, you're the grower, but also you're the manager, you're doing the books, you're doing this, you're doing that. You may have to bring other people on to help you, staff or interns or volunteers, whatever. So you can't do it all yourself, you have to manage people in that operation. And finally, the sum total is you've got operating expenses that you have to consider and identify and weigh against how much money you expect to be bringing in, the revenue you expect to be bringing in. So, what are those current trends and issues? And at this point, I should do have a shameless plug for a report that I co-wrote with two other authors for the American Planning Association called Urban Agriculture, Growing Healthy, Sustainable Places. This is a report that's part of the APA's Planning Advisory Services series of reports, PAS reports. Unfortunately, it is not available for downloading. It only comes in hard copy right now, but you can access it through the APA website. There are several links you can kind of figure out how to get it. So a lot of what I'm talking about today is developed in here in a lot more detail with a bunch of case studies, including here in Seattle. And I should give props to folks here who are here from Seattle. And Seattle is one of the leaders in trying to advance the urban agriculture movement, and both on the ground and within city government. So the city council and the mayor have made initiatives in that regard. So in the report, we talk about what these current trends and issues are. The big, broad conceptual challenge is this idea about how do you reprogram industrial cities? Post-industrial cities, really. Taking advantage of all the unused, underutilized land that's available. So because of that, Detroit has become kind of the poster child in a way for that, simply because there's so much opportunity in Detroit, because there's so much land available in Detroit, that you're willing to entertain a whole variety of ideas. So there's a pretty active urban farming movement in Detroit. Same thing in Cleveland, although because it's probably smaller, maybe less of a problem and the issue isn't as daunting. Cleveland has, from top to bottom, like Seattle, is actually at the forefront of developing urban farming as a viable use for a post-industrial city that's lost a lot of population. Securing long-term land tenure has been the issue for both community gardens and urban agriculture as long as I've been involved, which is 13, 14 years now. It's consistent and it'll probably always be that way. Something that is changing almost on a daily basis is developing ideas and patterns and models for how do you zone for long-term urban agriculture use. For instance, how do you deal with the selling versus not selling issue that I talked about earlier. Waiting in the bullpen after this is being worked out is the idea of livestock. And when I say livestock, it's both, big, big-ish animals, but also much smaller ones, like chickens and pigs and goats and even worms, if bees, livestock, basically anything that lives that it produces as part of urban agriculture. But what's backing all this up is that commercial urban agriculture is, despite all the obstacles and things standing in its way, is moving forward, really from in a bottoms-up kind of way. So, given all those current trends and issues, what are the questions that result from that? And I just identified two important ones. One was, does urban or peri-urban, which is farming on the city, not in the city itself, but on the metropolitan fringe, where you're on kind of low-density, kind of suburban, rural edge areas, does that represent a viable long-term land use? And then if so, who will be the future initiators of that? Okay. Historically, it's been a variety of people. Today, much of urban agriculture is being initiated by visionaries, individuals, organizations, many of whom are pretty resource-strapped and are always looking, how can we fund this really great idea that we have? But we're going to make the contention that one group of those future initiators are CLTs, both CLTs and conservation land trusts. So I think Greg goes next.
Is makerspace now? Here,
no, the slide, because it's all where it all began.
Oh yeah, okay, I'll do it. All right, so this is where it all began, right? For us, as a movement, and it was all about agriculture. As you heard yesterday, New Communities has risen from the ashes, and there's 1,600 acres that were purchased earlier this year. We used to talk about New Communities as this noble failed experiment, but they weren't failed. It was never failed. They were screwed, and now there's been justice, and now they're back, and that's fantastic. We need to remember, we've been a very housing-centric movement for a while, but we didn't start that way. All right. So this conversation about food is really coming back to our roots as a movement. It's not a new thing. It's important. We're going to put the land, community land trust. And we're going to talk about some examples of land trusts to inspire and inform. So, back to Martin. And how many people here are familiar with growing power? And how many people have ever heard of Will Allen? Okay. Well, my boss.
All right, so growing power began in Milwaukee, but we now have project offices in Chicago and a new one in Madison that I've spent a lot of time working on. But our home base, the mothership, is in Milwaukee, and so that's where most of these pictures are. Started out by Will Allen purchasing what were the last working greenhouses in the city of Milwaukee. That you kind of drive by and see on the street that the city had used for essentially growing plants for medians of roadways and things. So one by one, those 6 greenhouses were renovated and filled with stuff. And at some point, we outgrew that, and now we build these hoop houses, which we kind of bend aluminum pipe, stick them in the ground, and pull greenhouse plastic over it, put end walls on either end, and grow stuff.
All year.
All year. Even in the dead of winter, where we use largely use compost, the heat from compost, to heat the hoop houses all year. But if you go and take a tour of growing power, well, it's one thing about urban agriculture, it's incredibly photogenic. So it's like just a whole series of really beautiful slides of stuff. Microgreens everywhere, which is our major cash crop. Doesn't look good, but what we do is we have linked closed loop systems where you'll have that involves circulation of water and nutrients through various areas. So you'll have horizontal trays that you're growing food in, pots sitting in water, and the nutrients are sucked up through the pots. Then you'll circulate down here or here where we have fish, specifically tilapia or lake perch, that are feeding off the nutrients of the plants. They give off nutrients that then get recycled back to the plants. And this is Will here, and our foundation activity at Growing Power is making compost, right? Because that's what we're all about now. Is that you can't grow good food without good soil, and for good soil in cities, it can be very hard to find. So why not just make your own? It's kind of our thinking. And the way we do it is through vermicomposting, both kind of traditional compost that you can do in your backyard, where you mix carbon materials like leaves and wood chips and grass clippings, mix that with nitrogen, which is yard waste, not yard waste, food waste and other things. Mix them, all that. And at a certain point, then you start to add worms that are put the final touch on it through their castings. And when at the end of the process, you wind up with highly enriched fertilizer that we sell both in bulk and that we sell in little bags like this one. Another picture, this is all watercress here, growing in a very shallow tray of water that's circulating through.
Can I ask a question?
Mm-hmm.
When you sell the compost, does it make enough money to, no?
No. We're still heavily grant dependent.
Okay.
Because we have a lot of staff and we do a lot of things that don't generate revenue. So it changes, but kind of 50% based on revenue and 50% based on grants is where
Martin, can you talk about, Will talks about generating X number of dollars per square foot of growing area, or some figure, or per pot?
Yeah, and I'm drawing a blank now of what it is.
I don't know, I'm thinking $150.
Something like that, based on the square foot. And part of the reason we can do that is we're using fishing. Actually, I know where I want to show this one slide here. Okay. Part of the reason we can do that is that we don't just, in these greenhouses or hoop houses, we just don't grow on the ground plane. We have as many as 5 layers of production, even if it means hanging stuff from hanging pots from the framework of the hoop houses. Like I said before, there's a figure that Will tosses out, but it's I wish I can remember it now. Like I said, I'm kind of drawing a blank. And because we were historically on agricultural land, there was a loophole in the zoning that allows us to keep goats and which we don't, not for meat, but we use for milk, goat milk and then chickens. Now that was the original site in Milwaukee, 2 acres, more or less. Right? But as we've outgrown that space. And the trick then, and this is where kind of the land secure part of it comes in, is that how has Growing Power acquired land to grow, and in doing so secured that land, at least for a period of time, right? Which is kind of like being a land trust. So it started, let's see, where are we here? Okay, I don't know how well you can see that picture. This is 4 acres that we leased from the Milwaukee Metropolitan Sewerage District. Our composting operation got so big, we had these big Mount Everest compost sitting in the back of our original site, which we just couldn't have no more room for. So we entered an arrangement with the sewage district that had an old sewage lagoon near Lake Michigan that it had kind of decommissioned. So now we use it to grow compost, and we have trucks come in now. The amount of material we bring is so big that we have these trucks like Walmart. All the unsold food from all the Walmart stores in southeast Wisconsin gets loaded on trucks and then dumped here in the sewage lagoon. And we have 2 people that all they do all day is manage the compost. And that's the kind of scale in which we're doing this now. This here on the upper right, this is a greenhouse in the Forest Home Cemetery, which is the largest cemetery in Milwaukee. And they too weren't using it anymore, so they contacted us. We said, sure, we need more space. And so it's now brimming with plants, and this is also going to be our aquaculture center. We're going to shift a lot of the space in here to producing fish. On the lower left, this was our first rural farm. The Boys and Girls Club in Milwaukee has a summer camp out in Waukesha County that said, well, we've got kind of 30 acres that we don't really use very much. You know, would you be interested in farming it? So we've been farming here for almost 10 years, right? And then we use that, and we also kind of use, this is also kind of part of this is given over to some immigrant farmers. We give a half acre or an acre to folks that are new to this country who have farming skills that are looking for some way of kind of getting back to farming as a way to establish themselves in their new country. So some of that land here goes for that use. And our newest cooperative arrangement is with Cisco, who had 30 acres northwest of Milwaukee that they were leasing to a conventional farmer who met well, liked what Growing Power did, was getting older, didn't want to farm anymore. So that farmer, Growing Power, and Cisco sat down and renegotiated the terms of the lease. So now Growing Power leases the land from Cisco, and it's farmed largely by that original farmer. But see, there's this need then to feed the beast almost, and then how do we get the land to do that? Now, getting back to the idea of linking food production and housing, not far from our main site in Milwaukee is the largest public housing development in Wisconsin, the West Lawn Housing. And it's being completely gutted and redone through Section 8 and other money. Right? So this is what it looks like now, the size of it. This is a plan for at least this eastern half of it. And this plan doesn't show, this is an old plan, but since this one was developed, which is this here, this now is going to be community gardens. Right? And in the corner building, which is a multi-use building, we're going to have a store. And so some of the produce that we produce or some of the produce that's grown here will be sold in that store. Right, so you'll have the new retail commercial buildings along the street here, and all these folks living in housing, and many of them hopefully will get their food from that outlet there. And back in Madison, and again, getting back to bringing land trusts into the mix, that Center for Resilient Cities, which I mentioned earlier as being one of the land trusts that was involved in Troy Gardens, the Conservation Land Trust, is actually now in the building development business. And this is a project, it's an old school site in South Madison, and they're in the process now of of developing a building which will be a 120 student charter middle school with a focus on sustainable agriculture and food systems. And growing power, the plan has been revised, but since then, but this is kind of what it looks like. So the school will be here, and we'll have several growing facilities basically on the same site. And the first group of students started this past September, and our staff, including Robert Pierce here, are already working with the students and have worked composting and vermicomposting into the 6th grade curriculum. And so this is what it will look like. Again, very much like the Broadacre City idea, where Wright always thought that each school kid would have a little garden plot at school. Okay, now why is growing power important to the argument that we're making today? Well, first of all, it's successful. I'm very gratified to be working with an organization that is as successful as it is. But it represents an emerging model of viable urban farming enterprises that are being replicated across the country. We have people come through growing power all the time for trainings, and they pick up the techniques and they go back to their own communities and start their own projects.
You want to talk about what are they, RFTCs?
Right, we have a system of what we call regional outreach training centers, and those are organizations, we have 15 of them around the country. And those are organizations that have developed a special relationship with growing power, in which we kind of make annual visits to those sites and do trainings, rather than have everybody come to Milwaukee. But it's interesting that I find as I travel through the country that there are folks that are doing growing power-like activities without really knowing much about growing power. So last week I was in Albuquerque, and we took a tour to these sites where people were building hoop houses and doing this and doing that, and none of them had been growing power. A few of them had kind of heard of it. So that suggests that we don't have the patent, or we're not the only ones doing these things. And so what I like about traveling so much is that I get to see how widespread all these activities are. Now, we do call ourselves a land trust, but in the strict sense of owning land, we really don't exercise that at all. Because the only land we own is that original 2 acres in Milwaukee. But what's happened is that we've, as I showed in that one set of 4 slides, we've secured long-term use of more acreage through opportunistic leases. And what this has done, of course, is expand our inventory of productive urban land. Now, the challenges that growing power represents are that we don't own the land. So lease arrangements could change. Right now, we have good relationship with all our partners, but there's nothing that says that the Milwaukee Sewage District can't call us one day and say, look, we have to rethink how we use that land. We have to kind of break the lease or renegotiate the lease or charge more for it or whatever. Right? So changes can still occur. So we don't have that absolute security. So our ambitions, and this is not just us, but it's other reasonably successful urban agriculture organizations as well. We can only scale up production if we get secure access to more production sites. Okay, so in providing food for more people, which is our fundamental mission, we often will kind of exceed our capacity on the land that we do have access to. So how do you get more land? And this third challenge is more kind of a wider ranging one. Fortunately, we don't have a whole lot of trouble acquiring land. Those sites that I showed you, in almost every case, people came to us, right? Because we're reasonably well known and have a track record, and people feel good and feel that we could steward that land in the way they want to. But what about less successful organizations? So one of the things we try and do is nurture or incubate these partner organizations we have to build up their capacity, to build up their skill set. So hopefully they can look good to another institution in their communities that say, look, I've got the 5 acres over here that we're not doing. We would like to see if you'd like that. Yes, ma'am.
I was wondering, in the leases you've negotiated to date, obviously you have claim to the agricultural product you're developing, but one of your products is also improvement of the soil. Have you negotiated any out clause that if a lease were to terminate, you had possession or right to take a certain amount of the topsoil which you yourself have grown?
You know what, I don't really know the answer to that, because I wasn't involved with the negotiation. But I can find out. It's interesting. So you want to talk about that?
Yeah. So I'm going to talk about neighbor space for just a minute, and then we're going to move on to the Athens Land Trust. Neighbor Space is this great organization in Chicago. I just have a couple slides of information, and I'm just going to show you pictures of examples of what they're doing. So what happened is, I don't know, 15 years ago, I don't know exactly what it was, the city of Chicago was leading a planning effort looking at a variety of issues. And one of the things they were looking at is the development of a comprehensive plan to expand open green space in the city. And at the same time, they had a lot of vacant lots, you know, with really no good plans on what to do with them. So they wanted to protect smaller, more intimate spaces that communities have developed, sometimes without permission, right? Kind of the guerrilla gardens. And the leading nonprofits in the community recommended a new nonprofit be set up to develop and store the gardens. So that the city wouldn't own this land, it certainly wouldn't manage this land, but a new nonprofit would be set up, and that new nonprofit was growing, was Neighbor Space, and which was established in 1996, and they were provided with, I think, 7 years of operating funding, which is very smart, so they could really focus on the work and not be burdened with a ton of fundraising. And these governmental entities, City of Chicago, Chicago Park District, and then the Federal Preserve District of the county, continue to be involved in a supportive relationship. But primarily what they're doing is they're just taking these vacant abandoned properties, a lot of them were property tax reverted, and putting them just amazing use. So what Neighbor Space does is manage these properties and negotiate leases with neighborhood organizations and other folks. And so these are just some pictures of what they do, but they're just a fantastic organization. And some of these are before and after. And these are all just little tiny green spaces in the city of Chicago. And it's great, and some of them are just flower gardens, and others are the focuses on food. And they all have their own identities. Here's a school garden. This is the Peace Garden. And they have green court, which is really cool. All right, so this is a vacant, abandoned piece of property. You can't really see it pretty well, but it's not very appealing looking. And then that's what they turn it into. And that's what they're doing in multiple sites all around the city. All right, this is attractive, right? All right, I'll just do that one more time. And this is a land trust that is either taking ownership of property tax reverted properties and then working with neighborhoods. And this is the kind of stuff that's happening all around the city of Chicago. They have group houses. This is really cool. This is the Eco Organic Garden. And so folks are also putting in artwork installations as well. And you've seen mosaics and other things come through in some of these other ones. You know, and this is all done by volunteers in terms of how these gardens are developed. And so lessons learned. So this is a land trust that's providing a great service to the city of Chicago. Number one, it's a shield from liability, right? Because there's some tragic gardening accident, right? And this is how cities think. Well, the nonprofit is standing between them and the liability. So, you know, it's not a very glamorous goal, but it's a real one. And there's an enhanced ability to work with community groups. Because if you're negotiating a lease or in a community garden, if you're dealing with a nonprofit versus City Hall, things are going to, you know, I think things are going to go a lot better. And this is an example of a land trust that has a long-term stable funding stream to do urban agriculture, right? Because one of the questions is, what's the business model? Well, this is one that works, where a city saw it was to their benefit to establish a nonprofit and fund it long-term. And lastly is the issue of land. You know, the cheapest price to pay for land is to get it for free, right? And so they're getting it at low cost or no cost. All right, now you're going to hear about a community land trust doing super cool work. I'll turn over to Heather Bennett.
We're also a conservation land trust.
You're both?
Yes, no one knows this. Of course. Yes.
that's how we started. I'm gonna borrow one of y'all's slides if I could go back and do that one. It'll take a second. Yeah, we're a crazy land trust that was started as both conservation and community land trust, doing both land conservation and affordable housing. And if I can, here, I'll show you. So the reason we got started to do that, our founder was developing a neighborhood, and she wanted to do a conservation neighborhood where a large portion of the land in the neighborhood was protected as green space. They have a huge community garden, these things. And as they were laying out and doing it, what happened is the more land that would become green, the less housing there was going to be on the site. Which, what do you think that does to the remaining housing? Exactly. So as the housing got more expensive, they started feeling bad about this. It's like, well, only wealthy people can live in these neighborhoods where land's protected. So she actually was in Atlanta and her car broke down. And the woman that picked her up, she said, oh, I'll take you to the land trust office and you can use the phone there. And Nancy said, I'm starting a land trust. And the woman said, and she said something about, I'm protecting land, something, something. And the woman said, oh, you're not a real land trust. We're a real land trust. We do affordable housing and protect land for people that need affordable places to live. So Nancy was like, oh, there's two kinds of land trusts, who knew? And so when they started, they did them both. And, but then I'll be really honest with you about how it all works. So, you know, you're kind of in two silos doing this work. You're doing the affordable housing, helping low-income people in town neighborhoods, close to services on the bus line, that sort of stuff. And then we're helping rural landowners that have had land for generations, the exact opposite, kind of helping them protect their land, and so it's not lost for development. It's kind of a dichotomy is, you know, when you answer the phone in the office, who you're talking to and what they're calling for. And one of the things that we've always wanted to do is sort of bridge that gap. And so we had been doing guerrilla gardens throughout the years for neighborhoods that asked us. And, you know, our board, we're third homeowners and neighborhood residents. And so they sit in on the board meetings where we talk about the land conservation program as well. So there's an exchange of information, ideas, and what's happened over time is different people have been on the board and rotated off, and now there's more of an awareness about eating healthy and these sorts of things in the in-town neighborhoods. They've come back to us and said, can you help us have a garden here? And luckily, we did just get a grant, it's a year old now, from NIFA, which is National Institute of Food and Agriculture, which used to be Cooperative Extension, which is part of USDA. So anyway, they have a funding stream to do this type of work, and we were able to bring in this third sort of arm of our organization in between the other two. So there we go. I guess we were one of 30 to get this amazing grant, and
It's highly competitive.
Yes. So we were lucky.
And I would say that the land trust aspect of it was really caught people's attention.
Great. Yeah. You know, when people ask us all the time,
Are they tight?
I guess so. Anyway, people ask us all the time, you know, why do you do these two divergent issues? And I just wanted to make sure everyone understands that they're not completely separate issues, right? It's all land use. What else to say about the program? I mean, one of the first things that we did was, the beauty of GIS is start mapping where our housing is located in the community, where there are food deserts, which means that people can't get access to healthy, fresh food, and start finding areas where we need to put gardens in, even if people haven't asked, go to them and see if they want a garden. Anyway, the other amazing partner that we've had in all this are, like I said, the board members that have rotated off. A lot of the African American churches now in our community, the big push by the pastors is healthier congregations. The disease, the obesity rate in Georgia is, it's not pretty. And all the churches are doing these biggest loser competitions, and part of it is they've come to us and we've been putting gardens in on the church property or on neighbors' property that have given the land to the church to use with a long-term lease. We got some photos of those. Oh, it's so exciting. We're the poorest county in the country for over 100,000 people. So, I mean, the poverty and the food insecurity is pretty great in Athens. All these important things to see. And you know, for us, it's a way to preserve green space in these neighborhoods that have often been neglected, and in the planning process, that wasn't something that the community was looking to provide for these lower income neighborhoods. Parks and things like that, I guess, are what people used to consider as a source of where crime would happen and those sorts of things. So why give those people, you know, that's the kind of thing that's heard. So we're providing space for people to get out and be healthy in their community. Yes, I say it, I'm only repeating what I've heard. Yes. Anyway, and one of the, I guess the first garden that we did, sorry, these aren't my slides. They were presented, I guess, in Albuquerque last week. So I adopted them. One thing I will say, the university in Athens has been a huge partner for us. There's a horticulture professor who's been a member of our organization for years, and he's a man with a tiller. And he will just show up in neighborhoods and till things up. And then we come behind and work with the neighborhood to plant it up. Green belt around the county because Atlanta tries to sprawl over into us. And so we put a green belt around. And so that area is where it's appropriate for ag because that's how it's been zoned. So that's where we have to put the market garden to grow, to sell. The other thing that we do with the land conservation program that it all ties together is just outside of our county, our rural counties, and some of them, especially the one between Atlanta and Athens, it has prime soils for agriculture, and it was also had the most development pressure for any county, I think in the country. Farm, what was it called, Rural Life magazine or something like that, kept picking it as the most idyllic place to move to. So they kept taking the farms and turning them into subdivisions, and then the people would complain about the smell of the farms next door. You know, these things.
What was the name of that magazine?
I can't remember. I don't know if it's Farmer's Life. Some kind of, you know. So anyway, that's one of our other programs we work with USDA on is we buy farmers' development rights, mostly in that county, and protect that farmland. And so those are big, they're not commercial farms, they're family farms that have been in the families for generations, but bigger, and that's where livestock, grass-fed beef, that sort of stuff is going on, and it's being provided to the in-town restaurants in Athens. So, you know, it's creating a new economy. I think that everyone's kind of looking at this locally grown, locally raised, and then so your stuff's not trucked in. Anyway, these are some of the gardens, and we've got a lot more in the works. So we've got 2 more years left in the grant, and the hope is that it will be sustainable after that point. That's why I'm asking about the compost. What can we start selling to raise the money to keep this going? Because there is a need. This is our first garden, and it was on a vacant lot. One of our board members lived in this Brooklyn neighborhood, which is a historically African-American neighborhood, and they had a vacant lot where drug activity was occurring. And she came to us on the board and said, can we do something here to I guess, raise awareness and also put eyes on the street and try to help this problem. So we went in and built raised beds, and the crime's completely dropped off. And it's nice, they have a celebration every year with the Weed and Seed program with the police officers. They come in and the mayor comes in and everyone just talks about how it's so important that if a community wants to take back their neighborhood, they can.
Who owns this lot?
Yeah, it's a It's a man who grew up in the neighborhood, moved away up north. This happens quite a bit in our area, and he and all his siblings and cousins, and so it's got title problems. They can't really sell it, and he said, "Sure, use it." So it's one of those things that I don't know how, you know, it may not last forever, but it's lasted for 12 or 14 years now. So it's been there a good while. The other cool thing about the garden program that it's done for us, I heard someone the other day was talking about, I guess we're underserving the Latino population with our homeownership programs. And of course, as the person who runs the housing program, I think, well, there are reasons it's difficult, you know, to get mortgages and those sorts of things, depending on things. But the garden program, we can completely serve that population, and it's been fabulous. There are a lot of mobile home parks that have lots of land and lots of kids that need after-school activities. So we've got youth gardening programs going on after school in the mobile home parks. Yeah. And the Council on Aging is a cool program. This is where the seniors go, and they have a day program for seniors that need, I guess, I don't know what exactly you call it, but anyway, they go there during the day if their caretakers have jobs, and they have a gardening program where people get to get out. They have raised beds so they don't have to bend over, and the goal is, I think about 50% of the food for Meals on Wheels will come out of the garden. So they'll have fresh vegetables, and that's, we also are expanding into a parking lot on this site. And the plan is to put up greenhouses, hoop houses, so that we can year-round have stuff for the Meals on Wheels. This is one of the churches where the pastor made the call. You guys got to get healthy, and it's a former board member that came back to Land Trust and said, "Can you help us? We really want a garden here," and it's been amazing. And it's in one of the historic African American neighborhoods. And the nice thing is, you know, we keep taking people on tours of this, trying to raise awareness, and you'll show up and it'll be 4 or 5 o'clock in the afternoon, and church members that live in the neighborhood will have walked in and be walking home with fresh vegetables that they just picked out of the garden. It's nice to see. Another mostly Latino neighborhood, and the Boys and Girls Club's involved. So the after-school program with the Boys and Girls Club, they come out and garden. Do you guys have any questions? Yes.
So on your urban gardens, it's kind of, I have 2 questions.
Yeah, ask Coach.
So are they primarily owned by the CLT, or are they primarily just you're just managing the gardens itself?
Yeah, we try to get leases. Right now, I think kind of like what you're talking about, people come to us with land saying, "I'm not using this," or "the family can't use this," or whatever the thing is. The housing authority has lots of extra space in their developments that they've offered up to us. So it's just long-term agreements of understanding with different groups to use it. If we're going to build raised beds and put a lot of infrastructure in, we need to make sure there's a long-term lease, but we don't own it. And one of the issues with that is, at least in Georgia, we have to pay taxes on stuff that we own. And if there's not a revenue source, we can't really just keep taking on ownership of land. And as a conservation land trust, it's not what we do. We just, you know, we put easements and protect land, but the landowners still own it. So.
Is there tax benefit to the landowner?
It's a good question. I think there could be on some of them, because there's an ag designation or a conservation use designation that the tax assessors reduce the value of your property. So I guess most of these are so small that I don't know if they would go for that. Our tax assessor isn't. So we're the smallest county in Georgia, and the University of Georgia is in our county, and they take up about 50% of the land, which is off the tax rolls. So every other parcel, they try to squeeze it out of us. So that's one of the reasons we are, you know, we don't take on a lot of land and try to fight that battle.
My second question was, on your the purchase of development rights that you do in the county, do you add any affordability protection on your easement?
Such a good question. That is in the works. It's funny because our conservation director, we've been talking about it, and her response is, they already think we're communists. I just don't know how this is going to go. And I said, I know, but that's, it's the same feeling when you start the program with the affordable housing. I think you have this, you're afraid that people are going to think it's some kind of scam or something, but then once people start understanding, the homeowners are all over it. And I think a lot of the farmers will be as well, because they come from that place where they are cash rich and land poor. And I think a lot of them want to see their farms continue to be farmed, not just gentlemen farmers that have a lot of money that want a rural setting that has lower tax benefits. So it's in the works.
I could see that with, a county that's so close to Atlanta that just buying the development rights wouldn't necessarily affect the affordability.
Not the affordability. No, I agree.
I had two questions. One, sort of following on that one, being that you are both types of land trust, what about using the CLT model for farmland preservation? Because that's the other way to go. Rather, they both work, but along with the enhanced easement, the other option, flip it around and create a 99-year lease with a farming requirement.
This is a good question. It gets so complicated because the benefits of the conservation program and doing the easements, the tax benefits are so huge, and they can transfer or sell those tax benefits. So it's another source of income that I don't know if we did the 99-year lease, there would be any way to do those same tax benefits that you could transfer.
I would just make the point that community land trusts don't have to own land to protect it. I think you need to think a lot more expansively. And if you can tie land up for 99 years, that's just as good as owning it. So don't limit your thinking to ownership, because I think there's lots more tools that we could use that don't require us to come up with so much money.
Can I ask a second question for all of you? Going back to the question, the money question, housing has to be subsidized when we do housing, but we do generate some money through the use of the land, to the extent that the residents can afford it. And I guess my question is, since urban agriculture, urban gardening is providing us as a community with a good, do you see any kind of income generation that could help pay for access? I mean, right now we kind of like to get our community garden for free, and I get or for some very nominal rent we pay the city maybe or something. So I'm wondering if either through the semi-commercial, the local markets, or whatever, if any of you see models that are maybe helping pay for that access.
That's what I was asking him, because that's what we're looking for. I mean, we're looking into a CSA. Actually, one of the farms that we protected, the guy who owned it, his widow has it now, and she's not using it. She's offered it to us to use for something, and so it's on our radar to try to set up a CSA there. But then it gets into all these questions about, do we have the capacity? Is there, what's this going to cost? What are the taxes going to be? Can we make enough? And also, not to offend, but one thing I have found is, the affordable housing world, we have our all quirks, and Habitat has their little thing, and we have our thing. But the farmer world, man, it is so much more complicated, and, we're partners with all these groups and the farmers market and all these things, but the farmers market's vicious. Like, there's no way they're going to let our subsidized farmers have a stall to compete against them, and I understand it, but it gets it gets tricky trying to compete with people that aren't receiving help.
I just want to throw out a couple thoughts on funding. This is new stuff, or at least this, I think we're in a new era here, so the question is, how do you make some money in this? So there's stuff we know, there's stuff that we don't know. It's new, and so we don't have all the answers yet. But here's one that I do know. Philanthropists love food more than they love affordable housing. All right? And the wealthiest people in your community, I'm imagining, are very difficult to engage in terms of them giving you a major gift for an affordable housing project. But if they're giving money to a symphony, right, they're going to give a lot of, they're going to support the arts, whether it's music or the visual arts. And food is right up there. And in my experience, the big philanthropists are very interested in food. And the Resilience Research Center, which is the project Martin looked at, actually the initial conceptual work was done by a community land trust. And that organization took it over, and they got deep into the philanthropy community to support that project in a way that, and what this does is it opens up conversations. You get to a community gardens project that puts you in conversations with donors you would otherwise never have a conversation with, and you could use that in turn to leverage funding back to your housing program. All right? And I know for us in Madison, we got far more attention for our urban ag efforts than for our housing efforts. So there's indirect benefit. So, you know, keep that piece in mind. Also, if you're doing housing development right now, it's a brutal market out there. How do you differentiate your product? If you blend in a food production component to it and other people aren't doing it, just like doing green building, this is the stuff that distinguishes your product and enables you to sell. And if you want to incorporate a market rate element, that's a, you know, and you can make more, you know, you can do a little market rate housing if you want. And this is stuff that isn't being met on the market rate side either. CDBG money can be used to buy land for community gardens. Right? Remember that one. Because then you're using grant money to buy your land, so you don't have to, so there's not a loan to be repaid. Okay? And then there's all this ag money, USDA, I don't even know what it all is, but there's lots of it and we just need to learn. I don't think the ag world is any more complex than the affordable housing world, because we're super complicated and painful to deal with as well. It's just new stuff to learn. You can either learn it yourself or partner with folks who know. And even if you partner, you still need to learn something, because you need to be able to figure out who to partner with.
I would add, if I can, Greg, that there's a whole movement, the Community Food Security Coalition and the Community Food Security Movement. It's already out there, and in places like Detroit and Flint, Michigan, and they're battling land grabs. I mean, they're battling investors, and we just heard about it in our last session in Oakland. They're battling investors buying up land and tying it up. So, you know, that's also what's promising. So maybe, you know, maybe we don't necessarily have to, you know, think about revenue generation in the sense of like our traditional grant sources or who's going to be using the land. If we're partnering with a nonprofit that wants to manage the gardens and will pay us a lease rate, then, you know, it's taken care of.
It may not be a profit center, but you can cover your costs. You know,
Yeah.
John?
I think this alliance that you established with the black churches in your community holds enormous potential for our movement.
It's pretty fabulous, and that's the other thing is now we have this inn where we're getting invited to speak about all of our programs.
Yeah.
So the housing I go to Sunday churches and speak about, you know, the housing that we have coming up and that's available, and the gardens that we're, you know, to ask if anyone wants a garden. It is pretty amazing, and the services are really nice.
Just a few closing thoughts. So what can you do, right? Well, there's community gardens, existing ones in need of protection. Nationally, most of the community gardens are not permanently protected. In Madison, there's only one permanently protected community garden. That's the one that the Community Land Trust owns. And I think that's a huge role, is just protecting land. Ag in cities historically was viewed as more of a temporary use. Now people want to preserve it long term. This is you know, with property values depressed, this is a great time to protect land and to acquire land. So that's number one. Martin mentioned cemeteries, right? Well, cemeteries used to grow their own flowers, right? And they don't anymore. But there's still some of those greenhouses left. And so in your community, if there's a cemetery with a greenhouse that's not being used, it could be something where at relatively low cost, you could have a place for 12-month agriculture.
Well, in Lynchburg, Virginia, where we have one of our regional training partners, the organization is called Lynchburg Grows. They moved into a 9 greenhouse facility, nine separate greenhouses. That was a pretty extensive rose production, ornamental rose production facility that was a family business for decades, and the last person in line in that family was ready to retire and didn't have anyone to pass it on to. So they were the ones that approached this fledgling organization and said, look, I've got this resource. We have a partner in North Carolina, the same thing. He somehow found himself with a greenhouse he doesn't know what to do with. And so the idea then is to make yourself available through the outreach that you do through churches or whatever, but also just snoop around. Will Allen found those greenhouses just by driving down the street one day when he was working at his corporate job. And just this light went off in his head saying, I can make something, make something of that. He had to do some meetings, a lot of meetings with the neighbors and the alder there who wasn't sure. They wanted to keep using that 2-acre parcel in plant production or whatever, as opposed to something that was a little more revenue generating. So there was a little bit of pushback there. One thing I also want to add, though, is that this question about, all of your questions are really good in terms of thinking ahead about how to make this practical. One of the both exciting and frustrating things about urban agriculture right now is that some of those questions have already been answered by others, and others have not. And so just in the last 2 days when I've been talking to people, I've told some of them, look, I don't have an answer to that question. You may be the pioneer. You may by default have to be the pioneer on this one. As opposed to other folks that I talk to that say, oh yeah, well I know these folks in Cincinnati or wherever that have done it. You should look them up. So again, that makes this both a very exciting field to be in, but also one where you don't necessarily, there's so many questions being asked and things are moving at different paces that you may find yourself being, being a pioneer in this, and there is no necessarily any model for what you're doing. You just have to work it out on the fly and hope that things work out, and then hope that after you succeed, that there's some way of letting other people know what you've done so they can follow in your footsteps.
Is there the different regional trainings, are they on the Growing Power website? If you want to try to see what closest one to us. And is there an information exchange also on that website?
No.
There is a community garden listserv, though.
They're very good. You mentioned that. American Community Gardening Association, CGA, I forget what their website, the URL is, but they actually do have a a technical.
They do webinars.
They do webinars, all sorts of stuff. We're not into that. We do sort of trainings there. We don't have like a hotline or anything. We probably should.
There's one other thing I do want to throw out there that it's been really nice to have the garden program for. The thing that I'm really jealous about Habitat is the way they have the volunteers that come in and build the houses, and what everyone tells us when we go to fundraising things, you have to have the philanthropists volunteer and then they want to give you money. Well, the way we build our houses is we bid them out, we have contractors do them, they're environmentally certified. It's not exactly easy to plug in volunteers, but with this garden program, it's so easy to send people out to the gardens to work in the gardens, and it's simple and nice, and they feel good about it, and it's a benefit.
So we're going to wrap up. So please fill out the application forms. One of the things we're looking to do is to turn this from a seminar into maybe a half-day course that we can offer on an ongoing basis. So please give us as much detail as you can in your comments.